Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be visiting Northern Ireland to look at the life of Fanny Barber. Fanny was born in Londonderry in 1884. In 1912, at the age of 28, she married a man by the name of William Barber. William was 30 years her senior, having been born in Sligo in 1854. William served the city of Belfast during the 1886 riots and was later appointed to the Central Police Office in 1895. 3 years before their marriage, which was William's second marriage, he retired from the police force and started working as a rent collector. The couple began their married life living in Jocelyn Gardens, Belfast, before moving to nearby Woodstock Road. A final move followed in the October of 1921 to live in Coultra near Holywood. William and Fanny were a hard-working couple who did not have any children together, although William had a son and daughter from his previous marriage. Their niece, Isabella Martin, who was in her 20s, began living with them in early December 1933. On Christmas Eve 1933, Fanny, William and Isabella were visited by a lady called Mrs. Dornan, who needed to pay some rent to William. Mrs. Dornan left the house at around 8:20 p.m. She was going to catch a bus, and Isabella accompanied her to the bus stop. Fanny and William stood at the front door to wave the two ladies off. When Isabella returned home approximately 45 minutes later, the house was very quiet. She rang the doorbell and knocked on the front door, but no one answered. As Isabella continued to ring the doorbell, she heard Fanny calling her from an upstairs window. Fanny informed Isabella that there had been a rough-looking man at the house and that Isabella should come in through the back door. However, before Isabella could do so, Fanny came down and met her at the side of the house. The two women went back inside, but the house was dark, so Isabella suggested that they went to get their neighbour, Mr. Conlin, to help them. When Mr. Conlin asked what was wrong, Fanny asked him if he had seen a strange man prowling around the back of her house. Mr. Conlin said that he had not. She then asked if he had heard anyone or anything unusual. Mr. Conlin replied that he had just been startled by some loud noises. Fanny stated that she knew Mr. Conlin would have heard the man, and then added that she believed that the strange man may have been hiding in her garage. The two women, together with Mr. Conlin, went back into Fanny's house, and as they walked through the garage, Fanny said that her darling was in the hallway and that she was concerned that the scoundrel was still in her house. As she approached the hallway door, she told Mr. Conlin to come and see her poor darling, repeatedly asking, "Who could have done this to my poor darling?" Upon seeing William, both Fanny and Isabella became hysterical and inconsolable. William had been shot dead. His body was lying in the hallway, partly against the front door, preventing it from opening. His right arm was stretched out in front of him, and his revolver was balanced on his forearm, with the muzzle pointing towards his hand. He had been shot twice. The police were called, and Sergeant Patton, together with a doctor, arrived at the house at around 9:30 p.m. The police sergeant took possession of the weapon and found that it contained 2 live cartridges and 3 spent cartridges. One of the loaded cartridges had misfired. The sergeant, doctor and Mr. Conlin carried William's body through into the dining room where the doctor examined him. William had 2 bullet wounds, one at the back of his left ear which had been fired at close range, and another in his chest. It was established that he had been killed with his own gun. It was noted that William was still wearing his gold watch and was found to have £46, 3 shillings and 4 pence on his person. This made it extremely unlikely that the motive was robbery. Additionally, there was no sign of there being a struggle in the house. On Tuesday the 26th of December, Fanny was taken to Downpatrick Mental Health Facility for treatment. She remained at this facility until the 18th of May 1934, when she moved to a private nursing home in Belfast. 4 months later, on the 22nd of September 1934, Sergeant Patton arrived at the nursing home and arrested Fanny for William's murder. When cautioned, she simply replied, "Oh, Sergeant, you know I didn't do it." Later that day, she appeared before the resident magistrate in Belfast and was remanded to Armagh Prison for 8 days whilst further investigations were being completed. During the hearing, it was established that Fanny was in a rather nervous state of health, and as such her defence requested that she should be granted bail. This was refused. A second request, that Fanny was placed under arrest at the nursing home, was also refused. A third request was then made that, as Fanny was a woman of refinement and in a precarious state of health, that she should not be taken away in the prison van, but instead a private taxi. This request was granted. At the time, in Northern Ireland, the most serious criminal offences were heard at the Court of Assizes. Fanny's case would be heard at the Winter Assizes in Derry in December 1934. After a 2-day trial, the jury were unable to agree a verdict, so the case was scheduled to be retried at the Spring Assizes to be held in Downpatrick the following March. The second trial began on the 11th of March 1935 before the Right Honourable Lord Justice Andrews. After a problem with jury selection due to one of the sworn-in jurors being the brother of one of the junior defence team members, a second jury was sworn in and the trial got underway. The prosecution presented the case that Fanny had murdered her husband because she feared that he was going to write her out of his will and leave everything to his children from his first marriage. They made several compelling arguments. Firstly, that Fanny had been in the house at the time of the murder and there was no evidence to support that anyone else had been there. They stated that the motive for the murder was not robbery, as William was still wearing his watch and had money on his person after he was killed. The prosecution also made a lot of references to Fanny's behaviour on the night of the murder, being both inconsistent and very strange. Her story continued to change and develop as the minutes and hours passed. They said that if there had actually been an intruder with a gun in her house, would she have really asked her niece to go around to the back to enter the house? They also questioned why there had been no attempt to raise an alarm until after her niece returned. During a police interview in the hours after the murder, Fanny reportedly told a police constable that her husband was a mean man and that she was concerned that he was going to write her out of his will. She went on to state that she feared that everything she had built up during their marriage would be taken from her and given to his children. The prosecution also provided details of a recent life insurance policy which would pay Fanny £300, which is the equivalent to around £22,000 today, in the event of William's death. Prosecutors also highlighted the many inconsistencies and changes to her story in the months that followed the murder. During cross-examination, Fanny claimed that she could not remember many of the events of that night, nor conversations she had had, or even that she had made and signed a statement. The defence countered these arguments with an entirely different explanation of events. They said that William had been killed by an intruder in an aborted robbery attempt. Whilst they acknowledged that his gold watch and over £46 had been left on William's body, they stated that his rent book, which could potentially have contained additional money, was missing. Fanny testified that as William was about to sit down in his armchair in the kitchen to listen to the radio, the back door suddenly opened and a man rushed in. The man tried to grab her, but she ran upstairs and locked herself in her bedroom. She heard shots being fired, but then collapsed and did not regain consciousness until she heard her niece persistently ringing the doorbell. She described the man, who did not speak, as being around 40 to 50 years old, burly looking, with a red face and small moustache. He was wearing an old grey suit, a tweed cap pulled down over his eyes, and a brown scarf. The defence then speculated that William had probably run to the hallway to grab his revolver, which the intruder had managed to get off of him. As William ran to the front door, he was shot twice. Again, some compelling arguments were made to support this theory. Isabella, William and Fanny's niece, testified that the couple seemed happy together. There had been no issues between them on the night of the murder, and whilst they would occasionally argue, this was no more than what would be seen in any marriage. She could not provide any information relating to possible changes to William's will, nor did she believe that the couple were having any disagreements about their finances. The defence's most notable argument was the height difference between Fanny and William. It had already been established that the two shots that killed William had been fired with a downward trajectory. The defence argued that William was over 6 feet, or 1.8 metres tall, whilst Fanny was just 4 foot 2 inches, or 1.3 metres, making it impossible for her to have fired the shots. At the end of the evidence, at the request of her defence team, Fanny was allowed to stand next to Sergeant Patton, who was of similar build to her husband. It was noted that the top of her head barely reached the sergeant's shoulders. Additionally, one of the shots had been fired at very close range, and there was no blood on Fanny. The defence went on to argue that all evidence against Fanny was circumstantial and that she should be acquitted. On 12th of March 1935, the jury deliberated for just 50 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty, together with a recommendation for mercy. However, Fanny was sentenced to death with an execution date set for less than a month later. The date was set for the 5th of April 1935. As the verdict was announced, Fanny collapsed onto the floor of the dock, screaming hysterically. A doctor was brought in to administer some medication and help her regain her composure. After half an hour, she was lifted back into her chair, but when she saw the judge assume the black cap, she became hysterical once again. She was carried from the dock, still struggling and screaming. The black cap was worn by judges in Northern Ireland passing death sentences until the death penalty was abolished by the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act of 1973. The following week there was a petition for her reprieve, and shortly afterwards her sentence was commuted to life in prison. I've been unable to find exact details regarding what happened to her after this. One report has said that she was released from prison in September 1942, while another states that she remained incarcerated until her death in 1952. She did, however, maintain her innocence until the day she died. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Was Fanny innocent or guilty of the murder of William Barber? Thanks very much for listening to that story. I look forward to reading your comments. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and next week, if all goes to plan, I should have an even older story for you. Thanks for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst, did you know in the late 19th century, Belfast was the world's largest producer of linen? It was sometimes referred to as Linenopolis. Goodbye.